David's journey began not in the courts of royalty, but in the quiet fields of Bethlehem, where he tended sheep with care and sang songs of praise under the stars. Unseen by the world, but not by God, the boy shepherd was being shaped for something far greater. Day by day, his hands grew strong from protecting the flock, and his heart grew tender from worship. These were not wasted years, but divine preparation for a destiny the world could not yet see. The fields were lonely, but David never felt alone. The presence of the Lord was his constant companion. While his brothers learned the ways of men, David learned the ways of God. He played the harp, not for applause, but to soothe his own soul and offer melodies to heaven. Each note that rose into the sky was a seed of praise planted in faith, destined to bear fruit in a future no one expected. When danger came, be it lion or bear, David did not run. He stood his ground, not because he was fearless, but because he trusted the Lord, who made him brave. These battles were not recorded in scrolls, yet they were seen in heaven. Heaven watches what earth overlooks. While others overlooked David, heaven was preparing to anoint him. In the quiet of Bethlehem, where nothing newsworthy ever happened, a divine interruption was on its way. God had rejected Saul as king, and he was searching for a heart, not a heritage, but a heart. Samuel the prophet was sent by God to anoint the new king of Israel, yet he didn't know who it would be. With a flask of oil hidden in his cloak, Samuel journeyed to the house of Jesse. The town elders trembled at his arrival. Was this peace or judgment? Samuel assured them of peace and called for a sacrifice. Jesse, proud and hopeful, lined up 7 of his sons, presenting them like royal candidates. Eliab stood tall and impressive, and even Samuel thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the voice of God cut through his thoughts like lightning. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, each son was passed over. Then came the moment no one expected. Are these all your sons? Samuel asked. Jesse hesitated, almost embarrassed. There is still the youngest, he said, but he is tending the sheep. Samuel's eyes lit up. Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. The boy came in from the field, smelling of sheep and sweat, his hands rough, his eyes honest. As soon as David entered, the Lord whispered, Rise and anoint him. Die to anoint him. Samuel uncorked the flask, and oil flowed over David's head. In that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He was still a shepherd, still unknown, still uninvited to the banquet, but now he was chosen. Heaven had declared it. The journey of a king had begun. The valley was filled with fear. For 40 days, morning and evening, the Philistine champions stepped forward and defied Israel's army. Goliath, 9 feet tall, armored like a war machine, and arrogant beyond measure, mocked God's people without consequence. King Saul and his soldiers trembled behind their lines, paralyzed by terror. No man dared challenge the giant. Hope grew dim. But one day, the shepherd boy arrived not as a warrior, but as a delivery boy with bread and cheese for his brothers. He came from the fields of solitude, where he learned to fight unseen battles. When he heard Goliath's voice, something ignited in him. It wasn't pride, it was righteous fire. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He asked. The soldiers laughed. His brothers rebuked him. But David wasn't speaking from emotion. He was speaking from experience with lions, bears, and the presence of God. Saul tried to discourage him, but David insisted. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from this Philistine. Saul reluctantly agreed and offered his armor, but David removed it. I cannot go in these, he said. It's with nothing but a shepherd's staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones. He approached the valley, where giants boasted. Goliath laughed when he saw him. Am I a dog? Did you come at me with sticks? He thundered. But David's reply echoed with eternal confidence. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. He ran toward the battle line not from fear, but in faith. With one smooth motion, he slung a stone that struck the giant's forehead. Goliath fell with a thud that shook the earth. David then used Goliath's own sword to finish the victory. The Philistines scattered. Israel roared. The boy who had been anointed in secret now stood in public triumph. The sound of victory still echoed across Israel, but with it came something unexpected: envy. As the army returned home, women poured into the streets singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." It was meant to celebrate, but to Saul, it pierced like an arrow. The song became a seed of paranoia, and from that moment, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. At first, David remained close to Saul. He served faithfully, played the harp to soothe the king's tormented soul, and led men into battle with honor. Everything he touched succeeded, for the Lord was with him. But favor with God often stirs fear in men. Saul's heart darkened. One evening, as David played his harp, a spear suddenly flew past his head. Saul had tried to pin him to the wall. Once, then again. David dodged, but something had changed forever. The palace was no longer a refuge. It was a hunting ground. Yet even as Saul plotted, God provided allies. Jonathan, Saul's own son, became like a brother to David. Their souls were knit in covenant loyalty. A bond sealed not by blood but by shared faith. Jonathan gave David his robe, his sword, and his trust, symbolically declaring David the future king. Saul could not bear it. He offered his daughter Michal in marriage as a trap, hoping the Philistines would kill David in battle. But David succeeded again, and Michal truly loved him. Even Saul's schemes turned into blessings. The tension mounted. Saul's hatred could no longer be hidden. One night, as assassins surrounded David's house, Michal lowered him from a window to escape. She bought time by placing an idol in the bed and pretending he was sick. David fled into the night alone, hunted, betrayed by the very throne he served. He found refuge with Samuel the prophet, but even there, Saul pursued him. Yet the Spirit of God intervened, overwhelming Saul's men with prophecy. And finally Saul himself, who stripped off his royal robes and lay exposed, mad, humbled, and powerless. David now lived as a fugitive. He had the anointing but not the crown, the calling but not the comfort. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was treated like an enemy. Still, through the fear, the exile, and the rejection, God was at work. Favor had provoked fear, but it was also forming a king. David wandered the wilderness with no army, no throne, and no security, just the anointing of God and a heart full of songs. He fled from cave to cave, city to city, constantly pursued by Saul's jealousy. Each step seemed to take him farther from the promise, yet every moment refined his character. His crown was coming, but it would not come cheaply. He went to Nob, the city of priests, seeking food and a sword. Ahimelech the priest, unaware of the situation, gave David the consecrated bread and the sword of Goliath. Someone watched a man named Dog, Saul's servant. That small moment of help would later lead to a massacre. Dog told Saul, and in his rage, Saul ordered the slaughter of the priests of Nob. David, horrified when he heard the news, was overcome with guilt. "I am responsible for the death of your whole family," he told the lone survivor, Abiathar. It was a bitter lesson. Even the righteous suffer in the crossfire of the wicked. David fled to Gath, the hometown of Goliath, hoping to hide among enemies. But recognition came quickly, and survival required humility. He feigned madness, scratching at doors and drooling on his beard until the Philistines dismissed him as harmless. From that humiliation, he escaped to the cave of Adullam. There the truly broken began to gather, not nobles, not soldiers, but the distressed, the indebted, and the discontented. 400 men found their captain in the cave. Outcasts found a leader. David found a purpose. Even on the run, David never stopped seeking God. In the desert of Judah, he wrote psalms of longing and faith. "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. In a dry and weary land where there is no water." When enemies rose against him, he inquired of the Lord. When betrayed by nearby towns, sought divine guidance instead of vengeance. He saved Keilah from Philistines, only to learn the people would surrender him. Again and again, he chose obedience over bitterness. The wilderness was his crucible. Hunger, betrayal, fear, and heartbreak were his constant companions. But so was God. These fugitive years didn't break David, they built him. They taught him to lead the broken, to hear God in the silence, and to choose righteousness when revenge was within reach. The promise had not vanished. It was being forged, slowly, in the hidden fires of affliction. In the hidden darkness of a cave, something divine was taking shape. David, once a lone fugitive, now stood as the unlikely leader of a growing army. 400 men, soon to be 600. They were not the elite, they were the rejected. But under David's leadership, these broken souls were transformed into mighty warriors. In the cave of Adullam, God wasn't just hiding a king, he was building one. David became a protector of the people while still hunted as a criminal. He rescued towns from Philistine attacks, even though those same towns would betray him to Saul. Time and again, he showed mercy where others would show rage. Twice, God delivered Saul directly into David's hands. The first was in the very cave where David and his men were hiding. Saul entered alone to relieve himself, unaware of the danger just feet away. David's men whispered, "This is your moment. Kill him." But David only crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even that act stirred his conscience. "I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed," he said. Stepping out to show Saul the truth, he could have taken his life, but chose honor instead. Later, it happened again. Saul and his army lay sleeping in a valley. David and a trusted soldier, Abishai, crept into the camp under cover of night. Abishai begged to strike Saul with a single blow, but David refused. Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jug and called out from a distance. "Why does my Lord pursue his servant?" he asked. "What have I done?" Saul wept. "You are more righteous than I," he admitted. But the chase didn't end. Even while fleeing, David's integrity remained unshaken. When a rich man named Nabal refused to help David and mocked his kindness, David burned with anger. But Abigail, Nabal's wise and courageous wife, met David with humility and gifts, reminding him not to stain his hands with unnecessary blood. Her words pierced David's heart. "Praise be to the Lord who sent you to meet me," he said. Days later, Nabal died, and David took Abigail as his wife, his wisdom rewarded, his restraint vindicated. These cave years were not just about survival, they were preparation for the throne. David learned to lead with mercy, to govern with restraint, and to trust God's timing even when it seemed delayed. He had no palace, no crown, and no rest, but he had a heart after God's own. And in the caves, that heart was being carved into that of a true king. Ziklag, an obscure Philistine town, became David's temporary refuge, a strange place of exile for a man chosen to lead Israel. Tired of fleeing and weary of constant betrayal, David sought sanctuary in enemy territory. Achish, the Philistine king of Gath, welcomed him, believing David had turned against Israel. But David's loyalty to God and his people remained unbroken, even as he walked a delicate line of deception. From Ziklag, David launched raids not against Israel, as Achish believed, but against Israel's true enemies. He wiped out the Amalekites and other hostile tribes, eliminating threats while maintaining his cover. 16 months. He lived in this dual world. Enemy to Saul, ally to Philistines, servant of God. It was a season of tension, strategy, and deep dependence. Then came the breaking point. The Philistines prepared for war against Israel, and Achish invited David to fight alongside them. David, trapped by his own diplomacy, agreed. But God intervened. The Philistine commanders, uneasy about David's presence, rejected him from the battle. What looked like rejection was divine rescue. David returned to Ziklag, but what awaited him was disaster. While he and his men had been away, Amalekite raiders had attacked, burned Ziklag to the ground, and taken their wives and children captive. The once loyal men wept until they had no strength left hand. Then they turned on David. Talk of stoning him swirled through the camp. For a moment David stood alone again. No crown, no army, no home, just ashes and betrayal. Shh. But in that moment, he did what kings do. He strengthened himself in the Lord. While others despaired, David sought God. "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" he asked. The answer was clear. Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. With their urgency and hope, David and his men pursued the raiders. Along the way, they found a dying Egyptian slave, abandoned by the Amalekites, who led them straight to the enemy camp. David attacked at night and fought until evening, recovering everything: wives, children, possessions. Not one was lost. What the enemy meant for destruction, God turned into restoration. On the way back, a dispute arose as some men who had stayed behind didn't want to share the plunder. But David declared a new principle of leadership. The share of the one who stays with the supplies will be the same as that of the one who goes into battle. With those words, he united his people, not by strength, but by fairness. Ziklag was a place of pain, but also of preparation. It tested David's heart in the fire of loss and proved him faithful in leadership. And just beyond that valley of ashes, destiny was waiting. News from the battlefield arrived with torn clothes and dusted hair. A messenger from the camp of Israel. He reported the tragic end. King Saul was dead, and so was Jonathan. Mount Gilboa had seen Israel's defeat, and Saul had fallen on his own sword to escape capture. The battle that David had been spared from ended with the death of the man who hunted him and the best friend who stood by him. David's heart shattered. He tore his clothes and wept. He did not rejoice over Saul's death. He lamented, mourning with a poetic cry that echoed through generations. How the mighty have fallen. He honored Saul's position and exalted Jonathan's love of friendship, deeper than politics, closer than family. David's grief revealed the depth of his loyalty. Though hunted, he had never stopped respecting the Lord's anointed. Now, at long last, the door to kingship opened, but not in full. David inquired of the Lord, and God directed him to Hebron. There the tribe of Judah anointed him king. It was a partial fulfillment of the promise, one tribe out of 12, but a beginning nonetheless. For 7.5 years, David ruled from Hebron, while Saul's remaining commander, Abner, propped up Saul's son Ishbosheth as a rival king over the northern tribes. It was a tense, divided season, a civil war between brothers. Yet David refused to seize power by force. He trusted God to unite the kingdom. Over time, Saul's house weakened, and David's house grew stronger. Abner, once Saul's right hand, saw the inevitable and defected to David's side. He promised to bring all Israel under David's rule. But Joab, David's general, assassinated Abner in revenge for his brother's death. The unity that was within reach threatened to crumble again. David mourned Abner publicly, distancing himself from the act and proving to the nation that his leadership would not be built on bloodshed. His integrity softened the hearts of the people. When Ishbosheth was eventually murdered by his own men, David didn't celebrate. He executed the assassins and mourned the fallen, making it clear his throne would be built on righteousness, not vengeance. Finally, the leaders of all the tribes came to David in Hebron. They acknowledged him not only as a warrior, but as a shepherd. In the past, even while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel, they said. And the Lord's word was fulfilled. David was anointed king over all Israel. He was 30 years old. From shepherd to sovereign, fugitive to king, David had taken the long, hard road. But through every cave, every battle, and every betrayal, God had been shaping him. Now crowned, David ruled not just with authority, but with a heart that remembered the pasture and a covenant with God that would shape the destiny of a nation. With the kingdom united under his rule, David chose Jerusalem as his capital, a city not previously claimed by any tribe, neutral ground upon which to build a new future. He conquered the fortress of Zion from the Jebusites and made it the political and spiritual heart of Israel. But David's desire wasn't just to reign over a nation. He longed to restore its heart to God, and that meant bringing back the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence. The Ark had been left in obscurity for years, forgotten during Saul's reign. David wanted it returned, to place God at the center of the kingdom. With celebration and song, he gathered 30,000 men for the journey. They set the Ark on a new cart, drawn by oxen, and began the joyful procession. But joy turned to judgment. When the oxen stumbled and the Ark shifted, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady its hand, instantly fell dead. The celebration halted. David was stunned, afraid. How could something so holy be so dangerous? He left the Ark at the house of Obed-Edom, unsure how to proceed. But over the next 3 months, Obed-Edom's household flourished. Blessing followed the presence of God. David's fear turned to reverence. This time, he studied God's instructions. The ark would be carried not on a cart, but on the shoulders of Levites, as the law commanded. Sacrifices were offered every 6 steps, and this time the procession honored God's holiness. As the ark entered Jerusalem, David's joy overflowed. He danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing only a linen ephod, humbling himself before the people, unashamed in his worship. The king became like a child, lost in praise. Trumpets blasted, shouts rose, and the city trembled with the sound of celebration. It was not politics or power on display, it was the heart of a man who loved God more than image. But not everyone rejoiced. Michal, David's wife and Saul's daughter, looked down from her window and despised him. "How the king of Israel distinguished himself today," she said sarcastically, accusing him of shamelessness. David responded with fire. "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this." What? And with those words, a line was drawn between pride and passion, status and surrender. The ark was placed in a tent David prepared, and he appointed worshippers to minister before it day and night. Music, psalms, thanksgiving, it became the heartbeat of the kingdom. In bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David was not just restoring ritual, he was reigniting relationship. The presence of God was now the center of the nation. This was more than a political act, it was a prophetic one. David danced not just for what was, but for what was coming. A kingdom that would not be built on earthly strength, but on worship, obedience, the presence of God. In the ark, David saw a glimpse of eternity. In his dance, we saw the heart of a king who knew where true power comes from. David had secured Jerusalem, brought back the ark, and led the nation into unity. Peace surrounded him. Victory followed him. And yet David's heart ached for something more, not for himself, but for the God who had raised him from shepherd to sovereign. Sitting in his grand cedar palace, David looked out at the tent that still housed the Ark of the Covenant and said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of God remains in a tent." His desire was noble. He wanted to build a temple for the Lord, a permanent home for God's presence. At first, Nathan encouraged him, moved by David's heart. But that night, God gave Nathan a message that would change the course of history. God said, in essence, "David, you will not build me a house, we'll build you a house." The Lord reminded David that he had been with him from the pastures to the palace, cutting off his enemies and making his name great. But now, God was establishing something far greater than stone or cedar, a covenant. This covenant wasn't just about David, it was about his descendants. God promised that David's throne would be established forever. One from his own body would succeed him and build the temple. But beyond Solomon, this promise pointed to a greater king. "I will be his father, and he will be my son," God said. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." It was a divine oath, foreshadowing of the Messiah, the eternal King who would one day reign with justice and mercy, Jesus Christ. Now the son of David? David's response wasn't one of pride, it was humility. He went in and sat before the Lord, overwhelmed by God's grace. "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far?" He marveled not just at the blessing, but at the heart of a God who makes eternal promises to flawed people. He praised God for his greatness, his faithfulness, and his unmatched power. This moment became the heartbeat of David's reign. He ruled not as a king clinging to a throne, but as a servant clinging to a promise. His victories were not his own, they were evidence of God's favor. His authority was not self-made, was rooted in covenant. David understood that the true strength of a kingdom was not in armies or riches, but in God's presence and God's word. The promise of the throne changed David's outlook. Every battle ahead would be fought with the confidence that God was fulfilling his eternal plan. And though David would stumble as all men do, this covenant would remain unbroken. The throne of David would become the stage for redemption's greatest story. And the name of David would echo through eternity, not just as a warrior or king, but as the man to whom God made an everlasting promise. Spring had come, the season when kings marched to war. But David Zerel's mighty warrior, the conqueror of giants, stayed home. He sent Joab and the army out to battle, but remained in the comfort of his palace. It was a small decision, one that seemed harmless, but it marked the beginning of a great unraveling. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city rested, David rose from his bed and walked on the rooftop. From there, he saw her Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, bathing in the fading light. Beauty met idleness, and desire gave way to recklessness. David inquired about her, knowing full well she was married. Yet he sent for her, lay with her, and sent her home. What began as a glance became a sin that would haunt his legacy. Soon the news came. I am pregnant. Panic took root. To cover his sin, David called Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would sleep with his wife and believe the child was his. But Uriah, a man of honor, refused to enjoy the comforts of home, while his fellow soldiers slept in the open fields. Even drunk, he remained loyal. David's plan failed, so David devised something darker. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield with a sealed letter in hand, his own death warrant. Place Uriah where the fighting is fiercest, the letter read, then withdraw from him, so he is struck down and dies. Joab obeyed. Uriah fell. And David took Bathsheba as his wife. The cover-up was complete. The king breathed easy again. God had seen it all. The Lord sent Nathan the prophet to David with a story. A rich man, Nathan said, stole a poor man's only lamb to feed his guest, though he had flocks of his own. David, enraged, declared that man worthy of death. And then came the piercing words, "You are the man." Conviction fell like thunder. Nathan pronounced God's judgment. You struck down Uriah and took his wife. The sword will never depart from your house. Though David would not die, the consequences would ripple through his family. The child born to Bathsheba would perish. His household would suffer betrayal, division, and violence. In that moment, the mighty king broke. I have sinned against the Lord, David confessed. There were no excuses, no defense, just repentance. Psalm 51 was born from this moment, a raw, aching cry for mercy. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. David's fall was steep, his sin great. But greater still was God's grace. Though he lost the child, though his house would face pain, David was not abandoned. His throne remained, his covenant endured. For God is not looking for perfect men, but repentant ones. This chapter reminds us that even the greatest of leaders are vulnerable to temptation. But it also shows that true greatness is not measured by how high we rise, but how deeply we humble ourselves when we fall. David's story didn't end with failure, it was reshaped by forgiveness. The storm David brought into his life through sin did not pass quietly. Though forgiven, the sword of consequence now hung over his house. It began with his children. Amnon, David's eldest son, became consumed with lust for his half-sister Tamar. Instead of resisting temptation, he deceived her and forced himself upon her a vile act that brought shame to the royal house. David was furious, but he did nothing. Perhaps guilt from his own failure made him hesitant, but his silence bred resentment. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, seethed in rage. He waited 2 years, carefully planning revenge. Then he struck. At a feast, Absalom ordered his servants to kill Amnon. The heir to the throne was dead murdered by his own brother. Fearful of his father's reaction, Absalom fled to Geshur and remained in exile for 3 years. David mourned Amnon, but longed for Absalom. Joab, seeing David's heart torn between justice and love, devised a plan. Through the words of a wise woman, he persuaded the king to bring Absalom back. David agreed, but even then he would not see his son. Absalom lived in Jerusalem, but for 2 full years he never saw his father's face. That distance, both emotional and physical, festered into ambition. Absalom was handsome, charismatic, and clever. He began to steal the hearts of the people, sitting at the city gate, promising justice, listening when the king did not. Slowly, subtly, he undermined David's authority. And David, perhaps weary, perhaps distracted, did not see the storm rising in his own home. The sword in David's house, spoken of by the prophet Nathan, was not just judgment, it was heartbreak. The family that should have been a legacy of faith became a battlefield of betrayal. The cracks formed not by armies or foreign kings, but from within, from a father's failure to lead and a son's hunger for power. David had faced lions, giants, and armies. But now he faced the unraveling of his own household. The consequences of his past choices echoed through the lives of his children. Absalom had returned to Jerusalem, but reconciliation with his father was only surface deep. The once beloved son had become a man fueled by bitterness, ambition, and vengeance. He had seen injustice his sister Tamar shamed. His brother Amnon unpunished him. He had waited in exile, nursing his resentment. When he was finally granted an audience with David, the two embraced. But the damage was already done. Absalom had no interest in healing. He had set his heart on the throne. For 4 years, Absalom crafted a campaign of quiet rebellion. Each morning he stood at the city gates, where people came to seek justice from the king. With charm and strategy, he intercepted their complaints, listening closely, offering sympathy, and whispering what they longed to hear. "If only I were judge in the land," he would say, "then every man with a dispute would receive justice." Slowly, he stole the hearts of Israel. He gave them attention when the king seemed distant. He gave them hope when the king seemed silent. Then, under the guise of fulfilling a vow, Absalom asked permission to go to Hebron. David, unsuspecting, agreed. But Hebron was more than a holy place to Absalom. It was the birthplace of his rebellion. Once there, he sent secret messengers throughout the tribes, announcing Absalom as king. Trumpets blasted, and the conspiracy ignited. Support swelled. Even Ahithophel, David's trusted advisor, joined Absalom, lending the rebellion a sting of betrayal. When word reached David in Jerusalem, he knew the danger was real. Absalom wasn't just another threat. He was family. The pain cut deep. "Arise, let us flee," David told his household. "If we stay, none of us will escape." The king, who once stood fearless before Goliath, now wept as he crossed the Kidron Valley, barefoot and broken-hearted, retreating from his own son. The people mourned as he passed. Priests brought the ark, but David refused to use it for personal gain. "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back," he said. Faith remained even in exile. David climbed the Mount of Olives in tears, his head covered in sorrow, his heart burdened not just by war but by the betrayal of his own blood. Absalom had won the hearts of the people, but not the heart of God. His rise was rooted in pride and manipulation, not divine calling. The avenger had become a usurper, and the kingdom hung in the balance. Yet even in defeat, David's story was not over. His exile would become a place of renewal. His brokenness would reveal his deepest strength. And though Absalom sat on the throne, only one king had been chosen by God. Absalom had done it. He had declared himself king in Hebron and marched into Jerusalem with growing support. The throne of Israel was now under the command of a son who had betrayed his father. Yet this rebellion was not only political, it was deeply personal. A father's love collided with a son's pride, and the kingdom trembled under the weight of their fractured bond. David, now in exile, crossed the Jordan River with a small band of loyal followers, priests, warriors, and the faithful few who had not turned their hearts toward Absalom. Among them was Ittai the Gittite, a foreigner who pledged his allegiance, saying, "Wherever my lord the king may be, whether in life or death, there will your servant be." In the face of betrayal, David found flickers of loyalty, yet his heart was heavy not just for his crown but for his child. While David fled, Absalom entered Jerusalem in triumph, with the once trusted Ahithophel at his side. Ahithophel advised immediate pursuit of David, to strike while the king was weak and weary. "I will strike down only the king," he said, hoping to end the conflict swiftly. But God had other plans. David's friend Hushai had remained behind, secretly acting as a spy. Hushai deliberately gave Absalom different counsel, urging caution and a full gathering of troops. Absalom, drawn to grandeur and pride, listened to Hushai instead. Unknowingly, Absalom walked into God's divine trap. As Absalom delayed, David and his people regrouped and rested. The wilderness, once a place of sorrow, became a sanctuary. Support began to return. Supplies flowed in. Mighty men who once feared Saul now stood with David again. His brokenness had not diminished. His leadership hit had refined it. He leaned not on power, but on prayer, not on vengeance, but on trust. Meanwhile, Absalom prepared for war. He rode with pride, adorned with a full head of Hera, symbol of strength and beauty, but also of vanity. The battle lines were drawn. The army of a father faced the army of a son. What should have been a family united in purpose had become a battlefield soaked in heartbreak. David ordered his generals Joab, Abishai, and Ittai to deal gently with Absalom for his sake. Even after everything, David's heart still loved the boy who betrayed him, longed, not for revenge, but for reconciliation. He hoped that the sword would spare his son, that perhaps there was still a road back. But war rarely listens to mercy. And as David's forces marched out into the forest of Ephraim, destiny approached. The rebellion of a son would soon meet its reckoning. The forest of Ephraim stood silent, ancient trees looming overhead as soldiers from both sides took their positions. David remained behind, too old to fight, but his warriors marched into battle with fierce determination. His parting command echoed in their hearts. Deal gently with the young man Absalom, for my sake. It was not the command of a king, it was the cry of a grieving father. The battle raged beneath the canopy of trees. David's forces, though smaller, were seasoned and strategic. The forest favored them. Its terrain devoured the unprepared army of Absalom. Thousands perished not only by the sword, but by the forest itself. Nature seemed to rise in defense of the rightful king. Amid the chaos, Absalom's fate was sealed by his own pride. As he rode swiftly beneath the oaks, his long flowing hair, the very symbol of his beauty and vanity, became his snare. It caught in the branches, and he was left dangling helplessly, suspended between heaven and earth. A soldier saw him and reported it to Joab. Despite David's plea for mercy, Joab had no patience for traitors or delays. He thrust 3 javelins into Absalom's heart, and the 10 armor-bearers who followed him finished the job. The rebellion ended in that moment, not with a grand speech or a surrender, but with the silent fall of a son who tried to steal the throne. Word spread quickly. A young man named Ahimaaz raced to deliver the news, overtaking the slower runner who carried the truth more bluntly. When he arrived, David, anxious, pacing, desperate, asked only one question. Is the young man Absalom safe? The runner dodged the truth, but soon the full message arrived. Absalom was dead. David's world shattered. The victory meant nothing to him. Power had returned, the crown was safe, the threat extinguished, but none of it mattered. The pain of a father overwhelmed the pride of a king. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept bitterly. Oh, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. The soldiers stood outside in silence, confused. Their triumph felt like defeat. Joab, frustrated, rebuked David for mourning the enemy instead of celebrating the loyalty of his men. But Joab did not understand. This was not about politics or war. This was a father weeping for a child who was lost not just in death but in heart. David had been chased by Saul, betrayed by friends, hunted by armies, but nothing pierced him like this. He had run from cities and spears, but now he ran from grief. And in that brokenness, he gave us a picture of raw humanity, of a warrior brought low, of a father undone by love, of a man still bearing the weight of his past. He was a king, he was a legend. But that day, he was simply a father, weeping on the run. The rebellion was over. Absalom was dead, and David's army had won. But victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief in a golden crown. The cries of the king still echoed in the chamber, echoing like thunder through the hearts of the people. O Absalom, my son. His men, the very ones who had risked their lives to restore his kingdom, returned quietly, as though they had done something wrong. There was no celebration, only silence. Joab, ever the soldier, confronted David with harsh truth. You have shamed your servants, he said, those who saved your life, your family, and your kingdom. If Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you would be pleased. His words were sharp, but they cut through the fog. David rose, washed his face, and sat in the city gate, the place of royal judgment. The people gathered once more, not around a grieving father, but around their king. Yet David's return to power was not simple. The nation was fractured. Some had sided with Absalom, others had remained loyal, and many had simply waited to see who would prevail. They wrestled with guilt and fear. Could they welcome David back? Would he forgive? The tribes debated, their hearts torn. But David, though weary, still led with grace. He sent messages to the elders of Judah, asking, "Why should you be the last to bring the king back?" His words invited reconciliation, not revenge. On his way home, David met both enemies and allies. Shimei, the man who had cursed him during his flight, now begged for mercy. Though Abishai urged David to kill him, David refused. "Shall anyone be put to death today in Israel?" he said. "Do I not know that I am this day king over Israel?" Mercy triumphed over wrath. Mephibosheth, the lame son of Jonathan, also came. He had not betrayed David, though his servant had slandered him. David saw his loyalty in the dust on his feet, the unkempt beard, the torn clothes. Yet instead of restoring all his land, David divided it, perhaps tired of conflict, perhaps cautious. But Mephibosheth asked for nothing more than the king's return. Barzillai the Gileadite, an old and wealthy man who had cared for David during his exile, met him as well. David offered to reward him by bringing him to Jerusalem, but Barzillai declined, choosing to remain behind in peace. Instead, he sent his servant Chemam, and David welcomed him into the royal household. Gratitude marked David's journey as he honored those who had stood with him in darkness. At last, David crossed the Jordan once more. The king had returned not in pomp or parade, but in humility and pain. The crown was on his head, but the weight of loss was still fresh. The people argued among themselves. The northern tribes complained that Judah had claimed the king unfairly. Tensions flared. The kingdom that had been shaken by Absalom's rebellion was not yet whole. Victory had come, but it was soaked in tears. The throne was restored, but so much had been lost. And David, though king again, carried in his eyes the sorrow of a father who knew that some wounds would never fully heal. David had returned to the throne, but the kingdom he reclaimed was no longer the same. Israel was fractured, emotionally and politically, its people divided by loyalty, fear, and regret. The fires of rebellion may have been extinguished, but the ashes still smoked, and bitterness lingered beneath the surface. The unity that once defined the people under David's leadership was cracking. Now the old lion bruised but not broken would rise to bring order again. Tensions between the tribes erupted quickly. The men of Judah who had first welcomed David back were proud of their role. But the northern tribes of Israel resented being left out. "We have 10 parts in the king," they cried. "Why were we not consulted?" Words turned into arguments, and arguments threatened to spill into more violence. In the confusion, a man named Sheba, a worthless and rebellious Benjamite, seized the moment. Blowing a trumpet, he declared, "We have no part in David. Every man to his tent, O Israel." And just like that, another rebellion sparked. David acted swiftly. The weariness from Absalom's revolt had not dulled his wisdom or courage. This time, he would not retreat. He ordered his new general, Amasa formerly Absalom's commander, to gather troops within 3 days. But when Amasa delayed, David turned to Abishai and Joab. Joab, though demoted, still held fierce loyalty to David and sharper instincts than any man alive. But his loyalty came with blood. As Joab pursued Sheba, he met Amasa along the road. Pretending peace, Joab stepped close, and in a flash struck him down. Once again, Joab took command through violence. With Amasa's lifeless body cast aside, Joab led the pursuit across the land. Sheba fled to the city of Abel of Beth-Mesach and took refuge behind its walls. Joab besieged the city, battering the walls with fury. But within the city was a wise woman who understood that Joab's war was not with them, but with one man. She called out from the wall, reasoning with Joab, offering peace instead of ruin. "Why will you destroy a city that is a mother in Israel?" she asked. Joab assured her, "I seek only Sheba." So the people of the city, acting swiftly, executed Sheba and threw his head over the wall. The rebellion was crushed, not by a battle but by the courage and wisdom of an unnamed woman. With peace restored, Joab returned to Jerusalem and resumed his place as commander of the army. David, now older, more reflective, began to solidify his leadership for what years remained. Though scarred by loss, betrayal, and war, he was still the Lion of Judah. His roar had not faded, it had simply grown wiser. But the days ahead would not be easy. The weight of years, the cost of sin, and the demands of legacy loomed before him. Yet through it all, David remained faithful, flawed, and fiercely after God's own heart. Peace had returned to the land, but peace in a kingdom does not always mean peace in the heart. David sat once again on the throne of Israel, older now, the lines on his face carved by loss, betrayal, and war. Yet the shadows of his past were not content to remain hidden. They stirred beneath the surface, and soon they would rise. A famine struck the land, a severe drought lasting 3 years. David, always sensitive to the voice of God, knew this was not a natural occurrence. He inquired of the Lord, and the answer came with piercing clarity. The famine was judgment for a broken oath, one David had not made, but bore responsibility for. Saul in his zeal had slain the Gibeonites, violating the ancient covenant Joshua had made with them generations ago. Now justice had come knocking. David called the Gibeonites to him and asked what could be done to make atonement, to lift the curse from Israel. Their answer was not silver or gold, but blood. They asked for 7 male descendants of Saul to be handed over, that they might be executed as retribution. And David, torn between mercy and necessity, agreed. He spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, but delivered the others. It was a heavy moment. The descendants of Saul were taken and hanged at Gibeah. Ritzbah, the mother of 2 of the men, stood watch over their bodies, spreading sackcloth on a rock and refusing to leave, keeping away birds by day and wild animals by night. Her silent vigil, full of sorrow and strength, moved David deeply. He gathered the bones of Saul and Jonathan, along with the bodies of the executed men, and gave them a proper burial in the tomb of Kish. And at last God lifted the famine. But peace would not linger long. War returned, this time from the Philistines' old enemies, relentless and bitter. David, though aged, still went out to battle, but his strength waned, and a giant named Ishbosheth nearly struck him down. Abishai came to his aid and slew the giant, and the men swore that David would never again risk himself in battle. "You are the lamp of Israel," they said. "You must not be extinguished." More battles followed, more giants fell. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Another bore a massive spear. One by one they were defeated, not by David, but by the mighty men he had trained and inspired. His legacy was not only in his psalms and victories, but in the warriors he had raised, men who stood firm, even when their king could not. And through these battles, David saw a truth rising like the dawn. His time was drawing to a close. The days of personal combat were behind him. His role now was to finish well, to ensure the next generation would carry the torch, to prepare a path for peace, for righteousness. And for the temple he longed to build, but was forbidden to complete. The past had cast long shadows over David's reign, Saul's sins, his own failures, the blood of Uriah, the rebellion of Absalom. But through it all, he remained a man who returned to God. Again and again, David sought mercy. Again and again, God extended it. And though the king's hands were stained, his heart still beat for the Lord. The years had passed like the turning of pages in a well-worn scroll. David, once a shepherd boy with a harp, now sat as Israel's aging king. His hands, once soft from tending sheep, had held swords and written psalms. His eyes, once filled with youthful wonder, had seen war, betrayal, victory, and loss. And now, near the end, David turned not to soldiers or prophets, but to song, to the sacred voice that had always connected his soul to God. This final psalm, written not with ink, but with the scars of his journey, was a song of gratitude and testimony. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer," he declared, and every word rang with memory. He had known the caves of Adullam, the fortresses of wilderness, and the saving hand of God more times than he could count. His enemies had surrounded him. His own son had turned against him, yet God had reached down, drawn him out of deep waters, and set his feet upon the heights. David sang of righteousness, not his own, for he knew his sins too well, but the righteousness of the Lord who dealt faithfully with him. "You save the humble, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them low," he proclaimed. He had seen this truth unfold in Saul, in Absalom, and even in himself. The proud had fallen, and the broken had been raised. He remembered the battles, the nights when death was a breath away, the armies that fell, and the victories that came by God's hand alone. "With your help, I can advance against a troop. With my God, I can scale a wall. The old warrior's heart swelled with worship. His strength had never been his own. Every victory had been grace, every song a gift, every breath mercy. As the psalm unfolded, David recounted the Lord's steadfastness. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is flawless. Though he had wandered and stumbled, David now saw the beauty of divine purpose. The wounds, the losses, the triumphs, and the shame, they had all led him back to the same truth. God had been with him. The song soared toward praise. The Lord lives. Praise be to my rock. Exalted be God, the rock my Savior. It was not just a closing hymn, it was a crown for a life lived between pasture and palace, between sin and grace, between man and maker. David's journey had never been easy, but it had always been anointed. And so the shepherd king, once forgotten by men, chosen by God to fit one last song, a legacy of faith written in melody and memory. His throne would one day be passed to another, but his song would echo forever. It's not because he was perfect, but because he belonged to the one who is. David's final days were marked by reflection, instruction, and a quiet strength that came not from armies or thrones, but from decades of walking with God. The once fiery warrior had become a weathered sage, his voice slower, but his wisdom deeper. Though his body weakened, his spirit remained unshaken. He had ruled for 40 years, 7 in Hebron, 33 in Jerusalem. Now the time had come to set his house in order. The king called for Solomon, his son, chosen by God to succeed him. David had many sons, some ambitious, others destructive, but Solomon was the one marked by divine favor. In a private, yet powerful moment, David charged him, not with power or vengeance, but with purpose. "Be strong, and show yourself a man," he said, "and keep the charge of the Lord your God. Walk in his ways, keep his statutes, commands, judgments, and testimonies." His voice carried the weight of years, of mistakes, of victories and tears. David knew that earthly kingdoms could be shaken, but those built on God's covenant would endure. Before passing, David gave Solomon counsel on unfinished matters. He remembered Joab, his brilliant yet brutal general who had shed blood beyond what justice demanded. He spoke of Shimei, who had cursed him during Absalom's rebellion. And he honored Barzillai, the old man who had cared for him in exile. These were not commands of revenge, but reminders of justice, loyalty, and wisdom. David did not seek to control from the grave, only to guide. In his final moments, David turned once more to worship. He composed a final oracle, a poetic testament of the king anointed by God. He spoke of justice, of ruling in the fear of the Lord, of dawn breaking over darkness. It was the last breath of the shepherd psalmist, who had never forgotten the fields of Bethlehem, or the God who had called him from them. Then, in peace, David died. The man who had slain giants, written songs, built a nation, and survived heartbreak after heartbreak breathed his last. He was laid to rest in the city of David, and his son Solomon reigned in his place. Yet David's story did not end in a tomb. Generations later, prophets would speak of a coming king born of David's line who would reign forever. And in the fullness of time, that promise would take flesh in Bethlehem, where another shepherd king would be born. David's legacy was not in the wars he won or the palace he built, but in the heart he gave to God. He was not perfect, but he was faithful, a man after God's own heart. And his story, sung across centuries, still whispers this truth: no one is too broken to be chosen, and no path is too lost to be redeemed.